BRICS countries, along with other global South nations, have expressed dissatisfaction with the United Nations for various reasons. Their primary issue is Western nations' substantial influence in important international institutions and decision-making processes. These countries consider that the current UN framework does not appropriately reflect their interests and perspectives. As a result, the BRICS states are advocating for a more democratic and inclusive framework inside the UN. For example, at the last BRICS meeting, there were calls for thorough UN reform to ensure more participation by rising states, including re-evaluating the Security Council's membership and the permanent members' veto power. As a result, there have been several proposals for significant reforms, if not a complete overhaul, of the United Nations to construct a more equal and representative system of global government. This video will go into the suggested modifications and the rationale behind them, Western bias and double standard. The BRICS countries perceive a bias in the UN and other international organizations that favor Western countries. This image is especially obvious in questions of human rights, where BRICS members such as China and Russia are frequently chastised, whilst similar issues in Western countries appear to be ignored. For example, while Russia is heavily criticized for its human rights record, particularly issues affecting the LGBTI community, and China is frequently chastised for its treatment of Tibetan human rights defenders, similar issues in Western countries receive less attention on international forums. One such example is the treatment of refugees. European countries have been remarkably hospitable to Ukrainian refugees, providing substantial assistance and resources. However, this approach stands in stark contrast to the treatment of migrants from other conflict zones such as Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia, who have endured considerably harder conditions and received less support from the same European nations. The international response to human rights crimes in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict frequently appears prejudiced. While many governments quickly condemned Hamas's attacks on Israeli civilians, there has been relatively little criticism of Israel's severe retaliatory measures in Gaza, which include cutting off essential supplies and using white phosphorus in densely populated areas, actions that have resulted in significant civilian casualties and are considered war crimes. This double standard emphasizes the inconsistencies of international humanitarian responses, as reported by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. The BRICS states argue that existing global governance structures such as the UN, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund are disproportionately dominated by Western powers and do not effectively represent the interests and voices of emerging economies and developing countries. They argue that their economic growth and geopolitical significance are not adequately recognized in these institutions' governance and programs. The BRICS bloc has stressed that these organizations frequently reflect a post-World War II power structure that does not correspond to contemporary global economic realities. For example, the IMF and World Bank have historically been led by Europeans and Americans, respectively, maintaining Western dominance in global financial decision-making. Many global South countries, especially those in the BRICS group, believe that Western-dominated organizations put stringent requirements on financial aid and development assistance, limiting their economic growth and sovereignty. They claim that these requirements frequently serve Western economic and political interests rather than addressing the recipient country's legitimate developmental demands. For example, these organizations frequently impose austerity measures and economic policies that prioritize debt repayment and fiscal discipline over social and economic development in receiving nations. This has long been a source of criticism because these conditions can result in lower public spending on critical services like healthcare and education, stifling long-term growth. Could you do us a favor? Let's take a little break. If you love our material, please click the like button. To help even more, please share your views and criticism in the comments section. Your participation helps us grow. Thank you. Ongoing geopolitical rivalries, particularly between Russia and China, exacerbate the problem. Western activities such as sanctions and political pressure are perceived as attempts to limit BRICS members' prominence in the global arena, exacerbating unhappiness with international organizations, especially the United States. For example, China faces various challenges from the West, particularly about its actions in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea. The application of sanctions and other punitive measures by the United States and the European Union has been interpreted as efforts to limit China's increasing economic and geopolitical influence. These actions have heightened tensions and given rise to the perception that the current international order is targeting them. One major point of controversy is the allocation of voting power inside the International Monetary Fund. Currently, voting power is largely tilted toward Western countries, with the United States having the highest proportion. BRICS nations have long contended that this does not reflect the current global economic reality in which rising economies play a critical role. For example, as of 2020, China's GDP exceeded $14 trillion, making it the world's second-largest economy, yet its vote power in the IMF does not reflect this economic prominence. Many BRICS countries say that Western nations frequently dictate global climate change policies that fail to take emerging economies' developmental requirements into account. They believe that these policies impose disproportionate burdens on developing countries that are still struggling to eradicate poverty and industrialize. For example, whereas Western countries advocate for strict emission reductions, BRICS countries emphasize the need for financial and technological assistance to transition to greener economies without impeding growth. The COVID-19 epidemic is another example of inadequate governance by international agencies. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted considerable gaps in global health governance. The BRICS countries have criticized the World Health Organization and other international organizations for what they regard as a biased reaction that favors affluent states. Issues such as vaccine hoarding in wealthy countries and the sluggish provision of vaccinations to developing countries have highlighted the need for more equal health policies. Another issue is the absence of fair trade. Policies benefit Western countries. They raise concerns about agricultural subsidies in the United States and Europe, which distort global markets and disadvantage farmers in developing countries. But how was the United Nations founded? The United Nations is an international organization founded in 1945 following the devastation of World War II with the primary objective of maintaining international peace and security, promoting human rights, and encouraging social and economic growth. 51 nations came together to form the United Nations on October 24, 1945, to advance peace and security through international cooperation and collective security. The UN Charter, agreed at the United Nations Conference on International Organizations in San Francisco, laid the groundwork for this new international system. The notion of the United Nations arose from the League of Nations' failure to avoid World War II, and Franklin D. Roosevelt coined the name during the conflict to describe the Allied countries. The UN Charter established 6 main organs: the General Assembly, the Security Council, the International Court of Justice, the Secretariat, the Economic and Social Council, and the Trusteeship Council. The General Assembly is a platform for all member nations, but the Security Council, which includes 5 permanent members, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, and 10 rotating members, is responsible for ensuring international peace and security. The United States-led Western Bloc and the Soviet Union-led Eastern Bloc frequently engaged in ideological combat at the United Nations during the Cold War. Despite these conflicts, the UN played an important role in numerous peacekeeping missions and decolonization initiatives, and its membership grew dramatically as many African and Asian countries acquired independence. In 1948, the United Nations launched its first peacekeeping force, the United Nations True Supervision Organization, UNTSO. to oversee the ceasefire in the Middle East. In 1948, the General Assembly also enacted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which outlines fundamental human rights that must be universally maintained. The conclusion of the Cold War presented new problems and opportunities for the UN. The organization expanded its peacekeeping and humanitarian activities, addressing crises in the Balkans, Rwanda, and Somalia. The number and complexity of UN peacekeeping deployments increased in the 1990s, and the Rwandan genocide, as well as the organization's failure to prevent it, prompted substantial introspection and reforms. The UN also played a larger role in promoting sustainable development and addressing global environmental concerns. The 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro was a watershed moment, resulting in the establishment of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. The United Nations enacted the Millennium Declaration in 2000, which established the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, to be accomplished by 2015, with an emphasis on poverty reduction, health and education improvement, and environmental sustainability. Building on the MDGs, the UN established the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, in 2015, a series of 17 goals aiming at eradicating poverty, conserving the environment, and providing prosperity for everyone by 2030. What may replace the United Nations? There are various ideas to reform or replace the UN. One proposal is to establish a new structure that better represents the geopolitical realities of the 21st century. This might include increasing the Security Council's permanent membership to include countries with major regional influence and economic power, such as India, Brazil, and South Africa. Another idea is to enhance regional groups like the African Union, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and the European Union so that they can play a larger role in global governance. These regional entities might address local concerns more effectively while working with a central global body on larger international challenges. Experts have offered a variety of options to improve global government, including the formation of a new body known as the Democratic Nations, which would feature a bicameral legislative system to better represent countries based on population size and power. In other words, that concludes this video. Thank you for watching the video. We sincerely thank you for joining us today. If our work resonated with you or inspired you, please consider showing your support by liking it and subscribing to keep connected with our community. We greatly appreciate your support. You can now view another video from our channel on the screen.